Hi everyone, welcome to the Turf New South Wales webinar, Talking Soils and Natural Turf for Public Landscapes. Turf New South Wales acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians and traditional custodians of the lands where we live, learn and work, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name is Matthew Plunkett from Turf New South Wales, the peak industry body representing turf producers in New South Wales, and I will be your convener for the event. This webinar has been made possible through funding from Horde Innovation, using grower levy funds and matched funding from the Australian Government. This webinar is part of a series of virtual and face-to-face events nationally to engage specifiers in improving knowledge regarding fit-for-purpose natural turf in various applications. We have two great speakers today, Matt Roach from Australian Sports Turf Consultants, and after a short break, Mick Badham from Ag Enviro Solutions. Before we get started, just some basic housekeeping information. If you have content-related questions for our presenters, please only ask these in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can in the Q&A at the end of the session. If you have any troubleshooting issues or any general comments you'd like to make about the presentation, please direct these as a private chat to ASN Events and our team will follow up with you as necessary. Each presentation will go for 50 minutes to 1 hour, with a 10-minute question and answer session after each presentation. We will break at 12:40 p.m. for 15 minutes, then commence the second presentation. A recording of this session will also be made following the webinar. I would like to now introduce our first speaker, Matt Roach. Matt Roach is the Director of Australian Sports Turf Consultants based in Brisbane. Matt has over 19 years experience in the turf grass industry, with 10 years as a research scientist with the Queensland Government. Matt has extensive knowledge and experience in warm season turf grasses. He is the custodian of Australia's warm season turf grass collection, containing some 160 different varieties of turf grass, and is the developer of Turf Finder. Matt will be talking about turf selection, installation and maintenance advice, what does fit for purpose turf specifying mean, and different installation methods and what are plant breeder rights. Over to you, Matt.
Good afternoon, my name is Matt Roach and today I'll be talking about soils and natural turf for the public landscapes. About Australian Sports Turf Consultants. We were established in 2012 and we currently have 2 staff based in Brisbane. We provide independent turf consultancy advice and specialist services to stadia, sporting bodies, councils, schools, construction and turf maintenance industries and the turf production sector. Our primary activities include sports field construction and redevelopment projects, writing technical specifications, project management and quality control inspections, sports field auditing, benchmarking, research and development, turf maintenance plans, troubleshooting and analytical testing. So to give you a bit of a background about me and where I came from to get to my current situation. I graduated from the University of Queensland Gatton College in 2002. I worked as a research scientist with the Queensland Government's former turf research program at the DPI or DAF or DD. We saw many name changes over the 10 years that I was there between 2002 and 2012. As part of the restructuring program with the machinery of change from the Queensland Government, our program ceased in 2012 And at the same time, I established Australian Sports Turf Consultants in 2012. My qualifications include a Master's, a Bachelor's, Diploma, and a Cert 3 in Horticulture. Okay, to give you an overview of today's presentation, the main topics from my perspective being the natural turf, while Mick's going to be talking about the soil, is fit for purpose. What does it mean? Plant breeders' rights, turf grass selection, specifications, turf installation, quality control, and also some information on turf grass maintenance. Okay, what is fit for purpose? I guess being well suited for its designated role or purpose. Fit for purpose gets thrown around a lot. In putting together this presentation, I was thinking, what does it actually mean and what does it mean for me? I guess at least 5 components stand out to me, from being the design or intent. What is the purpose of the facility? The actual design works. What design content is being put into the situation or the environment, the budgets during the construction phase, usage after the construction, and maintenance. Unfortunately, through the design phase and construction, we often forget about the maintenance component. So it's very important in relation to its fit for purpose. Okay, on your screen, you can see a design shot or a breakdown of turf grasses and turf grass selection. This is something I've only recently been working on in relation to what species and turf grass varieties fit where. So often we get asked the question of what grass will work best in what environment, but to finally sit down and try and key out the actual species and varieties, as you can see in front of you, is a bit of a starting point for myself. So working more closely with Turf Australia and also Turf New South Wales about what we need to do, how do we get such information out to specifiers like yourself. You can see on the screen the 4 key headings being residential, roadside verges and drains, sports turf, and foreshores or wetlands. You can see the different species there. Predominantly warm season grass species are currently listed on this template or design template, which I put together. And I'll be working to try and fine tune this over the next couple of weeks as well. It's something which we can work on and put together on our website, both the ASTC and Turf Finder website, which I'll talk about further. Okay, turf grass selection and quality. Unfortunately for turf grass, we often have unrealistic expectations. Too much is expected of the turf at times. And that comes from the client, what we call the Augusta effect from sports turf or golf, being the Augusta golf competition where every blade of grass is pristine and the surface is manicured to its highest. People often put a lot of pressure on wanting the best. So it puts a lot of pressure on specifiers, but also turf maintenance personnel to maintain that facility or turf grass to a situation that is fit for purpose. Usage of the actual turf area, whether it be parks and gardens, roadsides or sports fields, and also what resources, once again, are available to maintain that resource or facility. We have to understand that turf has a finite usage and capacity and resilience. All parties need to be aware and appreciate that turf is a natural medium and requires at least some or an adequate level of TLC. So when I talk about TLC, I'm talking about your maintenance inputs. For example, irrigation, nutrition, or mining requirements. Obviously, it depends on your environment and where it is, what can be undertaken and undertaken safely, but we must always think about what resources and what management is going to be undertaken in the short and long term of a project or where that turf grass is going to be situated. Otherwise, it's just going to be set for failure. Designs and specifications and also management plans can help achieve success. They're all very important in the process, the design process, and being fit for purpose of how that is going to achieve the end goal. Okay, in relation to turfgrass selection, I've listed a few points to consider on the screen, from being what is the purpose or use, location, environment, even microclimates as well. You get some areas that may have tree shade, building shade, or a wet area. So unfortunately, sometimes those grasses have to be different, otherwise they may fail and you're going to be fraught with management problems going forward. What soil type are you working with? Price, unfortunately, price is a big thing, and we all have to work with, but don't sell yourself short in relation to choosing the cheapest option when you may have longer term savings, particularly in relation to management. If you can get a improved grass with reduced maintenance, that's going to save the client longer in the long run. The availability of the turf grass, local suppliers, where do you have to get the turf from? Where is it coming from? The supply of the actual grass, being full turf or sod, sprigs. Later in the presentation, I'll talk about some options of supply as well. Once again, the maintenance, resources, the water during the installation. We came into a few discussions this week for a project of who was going to be paying for the water during the establishment phase, and that was to and fro between the principal. Fortunately enough, we hadn't started the project yet, so it was a good discussion to obviously start earlier compared to being caught out during the project. And obviously what labour is going to be available to maintain that, but also maintain and operate the irrigation system efficiently. Different grass species, you saw from the previous slide about the multiple grass species that are available, and I'll talk about a number of the, I guess, dominant or prominent grass species we use and the turf suppliers supply. The morphological attributes, so how that grass grows, it's the length of the leaf, the length of the internode, for example, and I'll talk further about that during the presentation as well. Wear tolerance and recovery, particularly from a park situation or a sports field, very two important characteristics of how that grass is going to handle that environment. Once again, maintenance and the maintenance requirements of that grass, and also being non-proprietary and proprietary grasses, for example, plant breeders' rights. So going on to plant breeders' rights, or the acronym being PBR, I believe that the growing success of the Australian turfgrass industry can be largely attributed to the release of new turfgrass varieties, which are largely protected by PBR under the Act of 1994. PBR offers exclusive rights to a variety. New cultivars are protected by PBR and are marketed and protected by a trademark or registered trademark. It's very important to know that you can't trademark or registered trademark a plant variety name. They are two different things. PBR grasses attract royalty costs to the breeder or owner, and as a result of the R&D or developments used to introduce that cultivar, the cost for PBR grasses are often higher, particularly with the marketing component that goes with releasing and promoting grasses. If you can only think about what grasses that you know of off your top of your head, it's usually because of those PBR and royalties and marketing of those grasses. Damages can also be sought of for loss of profit, etc., from individuals or companies. So turf production companies can't be saying they are selling a variety they do not have. If you call up asking for one variety, they can try to talk you into a different or similar grass, but they can't say they have a variety which they don't have. They can be caught in breach of the PBR Act. The plant breeders' rights itself provides protection for 20 years from date of grant of that grass. So some of the newer varieties that are out, they will still have quite some time, or 20 years. And with the industry at the moment, we're only just starting to see some of the PBR protection end for some of those varieties that have paved the way for the Australian turfgrass industry. One big example of that is being Sir Walter. Unfortunately, an example of the Sir Walter and the cultivar name, they could not trademark or register trademark the Sir Walter name. Okay, just to give you a bit of background in relation to plant breeders' rights, what does it mean? Where does it come from? What's the difference? And I guess what is the work that goes into registering a PBR variety? So I'm a qualified person on behalf of the PBR office in Canberra. So we're able to undertake field studies and trials and undertake the paperwork for the clients or breeders, whether they be from Australia or overseas. So in the next couple of slides, I'll just talk about some of the information we gather in the field from some of those trials to understand and measure the distinct, uniform and stable, or DUS, measurements of that particular grass. A grass must be DUS in relation to achieve plant breeders' rights. And also, the new variety, which is called a candidate variety, must be distinct from known or common varieties in the turfgrass industry. For example, we can't come along with the grass, say it's new, and it turns out to be an old grass that's already existing. So it's our work to compare the new versus old and making sure they are distinct, uniform, and stable. Just to give you an example of some of the measurements we take in the field, literally watching grass grow is what we call whole of plant measurements from its habit and diameter of spread. So it's physically measuring the grass on the ground with a tape measure, which is very painstakingly time-consuming and painful. However, you'll see how some of that information is important, not just for the registration of the PBR grass, but also from a turf practitioner or a specifier as well, and how that info comes in handy. So when we take diameter spread measurements, we find the largest diameter of stolons through the center of the plant. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen being number 1 is the first measurement we have. Subsequent measurement is transected across that being number 2, 3, and 4. So we take an average of those 4 measurements to give us a diameter of spread measurement per plant. We have up to 30 grasses per variety, and we have numerous varieties that we trial. So the process can be very time consuming. Some of the stolon measurements, actually what makes a turf grass different. You can see a couch stolon on the right hand side. Get to see or notice some of the different grasses, in particular after physically measuring grass stolons, for example, using a set of calipers. Measuring the number of branches at the nodes 2, 3, 4, and 5, the internode length, for example, also the color of the stolons, which can change throughout seasons as well. The stolons, you can see the brown or red pigmentation on the stolon there, where it's a very handy trait to keep an eye out for, where the color of the stolons do differ between many of the grasses, and it's a very good characteristic to be able to keep an eye out for, so you can see differences between grasses, particularly for contamination as well. Some of the fourth internode measurements, also including the sheath as well. Inflorescence measurements, so measuring the flower of the actual turf grass. Very handy traits to measure, particularly in the real world after looking at mowing requirements of the actual grass. So we're measuring the peduncle length. You've got a flag leaf. You've got the peduncle length. Sorry, that was the flag leaf sheath. Fourth leaf, and then the spike length and number as well. One big thing also is the inflorescence density. So how many seed heads are there in this situation within a 0.1 meter square? So it's very handy to know what grasses seed more than others, particularly from a management perspective of how often your mowing frequency may be, particularly in relation to the density of the flowering and also the height of the grass. Shown on screen is just an example of a couple of older space plant trials, which I conducted at the Queensland Government's Redlands Research Station, which is about half an hour east of Brisbane. So there are two separate trials there. The top left-hand screen is a hybrid couch or a hybrid Bermuda grass trial, and the right-hand screen is Stenotaphrem or buffalo grass. So you can see the actual plants growing on the ground where we can take those lateral spread measurements or diameter of spread measurements. You can see on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen being an old figure from 2002, but the different varieties of the bottom of the screen of the graph and also the mean plant diameter in centimetres. So you can see the information we collect from the diameter of spread is very handy in relation to looking at the growth and performance and coverage of grasses. And you can see between the green couches that are shown on that graph and how much they can differ over time. So particularly for a turf producer, they would like to have a grass that is fastly spreading. And also from a sports field perspective, they want to try and get coverage over any of those divots or bare areas as well. So the actual information acquired is very handy. The different colours on the graph represent different measurement dates. For example, recording on the data on the 8th of August, the 23rd of August, the 5th and the 19th of September. So measuring data over those 4 periods gave us, I believe, some very handy information about those different grasses. And how the diameter spread comes into a situation, particularly from the landscape or the park situation. When I think about it, I can see noticeable differences, particularly from edging grasses. If you're having to maintain paths or garden edges, you can see on the screen there the buffalo up the top and Kaikyuu at the bottom, being the Kaikyuu being very vigorous and fast spreading across the ground. So you think if that was a situation where you're needing to maintain edges, the Kaikyuu is going to require a lot more maintenance in that perspective. This is Roma Street Parklands in Brisbane, a mixture of green couch and a bit of Kaikyuu. By looks of the image, I can't quite recall the grasses that were in there, but you can imagine that lateral spread or that stolen growth that you saw on the last image, the amount of growth going over to the rock seeding areas and the turf practitioner needing to maintain that. So thinking about some of those characteristics is very important in relation to management of those turf grasses. Showing you some images from another PBR trial, once again at Redlands Research Station in southeast Queensland. This is back in 2010. It's from 7 months of dated planting from planting 50 mil plugs. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen being couch grass and on the right-hand side of the screen being a number of different Zoysia varieties. And you can see on the right-hand side the Zoysia and the mixture and differences in height and also from texture of those grasses. So the information, once again, gathered in a PBR trial can be very informative in relation to how those grasses are going to spread, how they are going to grow, and how they're going to grow unmaintained if need be. This is just an example of a roadside embankment of a photograph I took yesterday of Zoisy grass growing uncut, unmown. So the information gathered once again in the PBR trial can come in very handy in relation to turf grass selection of what would fit well or best suited to that embankment to try and reduce maintenance or to try and leave it as is. The grass in situ has been there for quite some time. There's very little weeds that is seen in this embankment, usually because of the tight density of the Zoisy grass, which is a very favourable trait for the grass. Okay, turf grass selection, some of the characteristics. What else to look at with the exception of usage and cost? I believe it's also important to look at the pest and disease susceptibility, the herbicide tolerance, and what pesticides are available. Obviously, you have to use turf registered products as recognised by the APVMA. The lateral growth, as we discussed earlier, the vertical growth, and therefore the mowing heights, the seed head development from a maintenance perspective, the wear tolerance and recovery, and also the shade. You can see at another park in Brisbane, the use of zoysia had been planted. Prior to this, it had been a very dirt-filled area with very little green grass cover at all. And the zoysia grass had been handling very well in the dappled to high shade seen in this particular situation. From a sports turf perspective, over a number of years, particularly in warm season environments where the golf course superintendents are always having issues with maintaining encroachment of common grasses, for example, green couch, into the putting greens, which is a ultra dwarf hybrid green couch. So having that contamination going what they call near the collar or the verge of the green onto the greens, one, becomes aesthetically unpleasing, and also two, the potential of causing disturbance or disruption to the golf ball, and also a management problem as well. So in this situation where zoysia grass was trialled, where the green couch was removed and the zoysia grass replanted to undertake or fulfill that collar situation, some very good and satisfying results from all reports of the use of zoysia around the collars. But once again, just because we've changed or they have changed from one species to another, it doesn't necessarily mean they wouldn't have issues from trying to maintain some of that zoysia into the actual putting green surface as well. So there are still management considerations that have to be thought of in relation to even changing between different species of turf grass. This is of an oval where you can see Kaikyuu on the flanks and green couch dominantly used in the high wear areas. You can see the quality of the Kaikyuu on the right-hand side of the screen being very lush and green, while the green couch not as green and a little less cover. However, the intensity and usage of that area where they have used and chosen to use green couch, where it can withstand or provide higher wear tolerance and also recovery than the Kaikyuu at the most times. Just to give you a bit of an example of some different couch grasses, there's a table with 5 couch varieties used in Australia. The variety names have been removed. You can see the plant breeders' rights symbols, the 4 varieties, variety 1 to variety 4 are newer varieties and are protected by PBR, where variety 5 is a non-proprietary variety and it could and can be grown by any turf producer. Unfortunately, you can see from the characteristics or desirable traits of what you would like to have, particularly from a sports field or park situation, being wear tolerance, thatch production, fertility requirements, mowing frequency, and also in this situation, salinity tolerance was important for the location for where those grasses had to be. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet with any grass. It's trying to find what grass is going to suit your environment and also your needs, plus your maintenance plans going forward. Let's give you a bit of an example over the next couple of slides of some different grasses. and common grasses used within the turf grass industry, and also parks and sports field situations as well. Okay, you can see on screen what we call couch grass, or hybrid green couch, or hybrid Bermuda grass. The hybrid couch and hybrid Bermuda grass are the same thing, whereas the green couch is more of a coarser textured grass, and traditionally the hybrid couches are finer textured. So more often than not, the hybrid couch grasses produce less seed than the actual green couch surfaces as well. So particularly today, in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot more of a transition to the hybrid couches, and particularly down in Victoria and New South Wales, where we've seen it for a number of years. Some of the grasses, like for example Santarana, being used after the millennium drought and the changes going to warm season turf grass. Hybrid couches is very dominant in the lower temperate parts of Australia. Blue couch, predominantly Queensland. You do see some use in New South Wales. Recently, we had a call from one contractor inquiring about Queensland blue couch down in New South Wales, and I initially said, well, I think the green couch or the hybrid couch would be probably preferable in situation that he was talking about from a tennis court. And he said the owner only wanted to have Queensland blue couch. He said that recovery of the Queensland blue couch in their situation was the only grass that recovered. And for me, I was pretty confused about that, where the recovery rates from research work I have undertaken, the green couch is predominantly far superior from tolerance and also recovery compared to the blue couch. However, the client had chosen for the Queensland blue couch, and they had to freight some down from Queensland to New South Wales. Kaikyuu, number of newer varieties on the market these days compared to some of the old traditional or cedar varieties. So we have male sterile varieties of Kaikyuu with no tall white stamens, which you'd commonly see across the surface. It's very visible. There's another slide later where I'll show you where those white stamens, what they are and how they stand out. Some of the newer Kaikyuu varieties are more cold tolerant, higher density, and have a greater turf quality than some of the older varieties. Some of the grasses show moderate wear tolerance and faster recovery. They have a medium textured with soft leaf blades. Okay, sweet smothergrass, used in high shade environments. I believe it's one of the grass species that handles the shade best out of all the grasses. It can grow quite tall, used in orchard settings as well, anywhere between 30 to 80, traditionally mown about 50 to 60 millimeters, has a very dark, deep green leaf or foliage. Broadleaf carpetgrass or carpetgrass, once again, a broader leaf, prefers the shade, prefers a wet soil. Commonly, you'll find it growing where you don't want it to grow, but it does love that wet, shaded conditions. Spreads by stolons and short rhizomes, can grow relatively tall if left unmown, requires good, adequate, generally wet soils. Prefers loams and clays, does have a low fertility requirement, excellent heat tolerance. We often see it up here in Brisbane and far north, for example, Cairns, but it does have a poor cold tolerance. Okay, the Zoisy grass. These days we see and hear a lot about Zoisy grass. Probably around about 2000, I know when I started at the DPI or the Turf Research Program, some of the Zoisy grasses were only being introduced and were relatively new into Australia at that time. Now we're pretty spoilt with choice with a number of different species and also varieties available on the market. You can see on your screen there from being top left, a finer texture grass being Zoisy matrella. On the top right being Zoisy japonica, a bit broader of the leaf. Bottom left-hand side, Zoisy macrantha, which is an Australian native. Once again, a broader leaf, similar to the Zoisy japonica from an appearance perspective. Some of the grasses of the macranthas can be a bluey-greeny tinge. On the bottom right-hand corner being Zoysia tenuifolia. So they also call that no-mow grass. Traditionally used in a landscape setting where mowing isn't going to be undertaken, and you want to see those undulations within a area. Okay, the buffalo grass, particularly in Sydney and Queensland as well, very known. The buffalo grass is very known to people as a result, particularly of Sir Walter and the marketing over the years. Widely used in residential lawns and parks, handles moderate to high shade, grows by stolons and what I call semi-rhizomes. You can see just in an experiment I did in my backyard many years ago, in pure sand, mind you, but the buffalo grass in this situation, in the 150 mil PVC pipe, the roots grew down 1 metre within 43 days. So the root structure of some of these warm season grasses, and you can see the bottom left-hand screen, some of the stolons with the fibrous roots of the underside of the turf grass of the buffalo being grown in more of a sandy profile. The root structure is very dominant compared to some of the seeded varieties or some of the alternates that are used on roadsides, for example. Buffalo grass does like temperate, subtropical and tropical conditions. Just from an ornamental perspective, you can see on screen 2 variegated buffalo grasses, good for hanging pots, very small areas. I did have an area of the white variegated buffalo on the right-hand side in a larger lawn area at my house. And people always ask, what did you do to the turf grass? Did you poison it, or what was wrong with it? So once again, it's the grass for a different environment. But if you were working into a situation, particularly pots or green walls, such grasses can be very appetizing for the general public. Okay, I briefly just want to show you about one of our websites that we have, been TurfFinder, turffinder.com. I'll just quickly link to the website. Just to show you briefly about TurfFinder, it was developed in 2016 by myself, predominantly trying to help homeowners and sports turf managers to identify where to buy turf grass from. Having worked for the turf research program, I always found it difficult finding where to buy grasses. So that was the primary background of developing this site. Plus, I had a lot of information on turf grasses that I wanted to put somewhere that people could access. ASTC, my business, we don't sell products, we don't sell turf grass, we are independent. So once again, putting this information on the website, making it available to the general public, allows us to have that information to make it available. Just to show you a couple of sections on the TurfFinder site, from being the turf producers. So there's currently 220 farms that are listed on the website. You can easily hover over, click on those turf farms. You can filter on your left-hand side of your screen, being your postcode, different turf types of what you're after, and that will refine your selection. So you can find a producer that sells a grass and also a variety that is close to you. Turf grass varieties, you can see on screen we've currently got 114 varieties that are listed on the website. 90 of them are currently commercially available. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen, once again, various filters that you can use to pick and choose to actually fine-tune your selection of the different grasses. For example, if I clicked on Aussie Blue being a blue couch, has information about the actual grass, different photographs, descriptions, background information, varieties, where the variety is actually sold, some information on the turf grass, and related turf grass varieties. Another key feature of the site is pest and disease and weeds. So if I click on the pest, for example, you can see the range of pests that are actually listed on the screen. So even from my perspective, an image is worth 1,000 words. So sometimes you think, oh, what is that? I'm not too sure. You can quickly come to a site like this to look at your pest and then to flick through the actual tiles to see where their pictures are and what pest you have. And the same with the weeds. A very handy site where you can click through, finding information on the actual weed and some control options as well. Also on the site is turf care information. I suggest you can look through this content. You can see after planting care, fertilizer, irrigation, mowing, pesticides, planting, seasonal care, site preparation, soils, and maintenance as well. As I said, we currently have 220 farms listed on the site, 114 varieties, maintenance advice, currently 18 pests, 17 diseases, 64 weeds. The content from Turf Finder is also currently being used within their resources and educational material by a number of campuses within TAFE New South Wales. ASTC is also the custodian of Australia's warm season turfgrass collection. The collection is currently located about 30 minutes drive south of Brisbane CBD. You can see in the image on the left-hand side, there's at least 160 different turfgrass varieties. I know when I first started, I thought there was blue cooch, green cooch, and not much else. So to work with the grasses and to be able to physically see the grasses side by side is a very important resource for the industry and particularly the next generation of practitioners coming through. We also have QR codes on each of those tubs or turfgrass varieties, which links information to Turf Finder as well to provide people with information. Okay, the turfgrass specification. We often see A-grade turf, B-grade turf, premium turf. What do they actually mean? From my perspective, I like to see black and white, no grey. So I want to spell out what the client wants and what we expect from the turf producer. We don't want to be going too far where the turf producer can't supply or can't provide, but you want to find that happy medium of making sure you're very clear about what you would like, and then they can also bring up any questions they may have within a tender clarification meeting, for example, if they're unable to meet such a demand or provide a variation or alternate offer. Okay, some things I like to look at with regards to turf specifications, inspections, one being a turf suitability and pre-harvest inspection, making sure the paddock is suitable prior to locking in a purchase order or prior to harvest or even before it arrives on site. It's making sure that it contains the appropriate or specified genus and species and variety that has been specified. How is it going to be supplied? Turf rolls, turf slabs, maxi rolls, the big jumbo rolls, reinforced turf, hybrid or sprigs. We like to see that the turf grass is supplied from the same farm and ideally from the same paddock. So that way there's very little age differences or quality or potentially different varieties that we see within a project. Depends on your project and situation. The turf farm soil may be very important, particularly if you're planning on a sand profile, for example. You don't want to have a heavier soil impeding some of that performance or drainage. Obviously, the turf grass must have no signs of disease, insects, or weeds, or undesirable grasses, for example, contamination. Turf grass is to have 100% cover. It's good to try and specify turf colour. We also have a turf colour meter, which we can say, for example, turf colour must be above 6, and we can use a turf colour meter to say the actual turf grass is an acceptable colour. Turf grass is to be mown a certain height. Thatch layer must be a certain amount. The depth of soil on a grass, I know with landscapers and architects, they always ask about, okay, how much soil or turf, what thickness do we have to allow to achieve our finished surface level, making sure that there's adequate soil attached to the turf grass. When harvesting, the turf harvester, the guillotine, making sure the edges are at 90 degrees to provide a sharp, straight cut. I'll show you an image on the following slide. Turf grass, we request to be sprayed with a registered insecticide prior to harvest for the control of lawn pests. If the turf grass needs to be washed, but also unwashed, that it can be transported, picked up, handled, manoeuvred into position without damage. And depending on the project, broken, torn, or uneven ends of turf grass, particularly for high-profile settings, would generally be rejected. Some further information on turf grass specifications, particularly for sites with erosion. Some very good content in the Australian Standard 5181 from 2017 from project work that had been undertaken by Bioscience Australia and Turf Australia as well. Just an example of a couple of erosion control potential issues from silt fencing and tunnelling, and on the right-hand side of the screen, where the turf grass was not the issue in this situation. It was another problem, but just to show you the example of the Japanese millet and the shallow roots of such grass compared to some of those root systems that I showed earlier, for example, in the buffalo, where they were 1 metre deep, and green couch is renowned to potentially have roots down to 3 to 4 metres as well. So the stability of such warm season grass is very desirable for an erosion setting. Okay, for turf farm inspections, shown on screen 5 different, what I call stages. When I'm undertaking inspections, I like to be around that stage 2 to 3 mark, around that 30% cover, where if I'm looking for undesirable grasses, for example, contamination, that I can see grass that is recovering. So in this situation where the white cross is in stage 2 is green couch that is recovering in between the buffalo grass. So it gives us a good opportunity to provide services to the turf producer, but also for the client or the end user when we're helping them to install the turf grass and provide the specifications and the quality control, that we can identify issues at the farm before it gets to the actual client. Just a bit of an example of some contamination that has been planted in situ. So the idea of those inspections and working with the turf producers is trying to limit such contamination. Obviously, you can't rule it out in all circumstances, but where the turf producers are trying their best and being proactive, it's very desirable to do so. I spoke on the earlier slide about Kaikyuu and the white stamen. You can see a white stamen on the right-hand side of your screen and a male sterile flower of the Kaikyuu. So you can imagine if you had a fertile flower and the white stamen of an older Kaikyuu variety, those across the entire field or park, they're very noticeable and usually very attractive to the birds and the wildlife. Okay, in relation to accreditation programs, in recent years, we've had a few come through the system and are still there, being developed and fine-tuned. For example, OSGAP, Turf Queensland and the Turf Accreditation Program. As part of Turf Plus, they have a Turf Cert program, and we also undertake turf certification inspections for clients as well. So I suggest that you look at those particular accreditation programs and potentially look to have those within your specifications as well. Okay, turf installation, making sure the irrigation, if you have irrigation on site, that it's fully functional or available to be used. Your delivery, what quantity is expected. For example, the sports field shown at the bottom of the screen, I think we had up to about 3,500 square meters per day. So that was about 3 trucks. If they have more staff, by all means, you can look to change that figure, but having the discussions with your turf producers and their layers of what is the quantity they're expected to bring to site, but just making sure that quality is maintained. How that truck gets to site, does it have a cover, does it not have a cover? Turf installers or layers, having a toolbox talk prior to them starting the work, to making sure they're working with your specifications and you don't turn up after all the turf is laid and you're not happy with something. So once again, just getting on the front foot to make sure you're happy with the how the project rolls out. And normally when the turf grass is being installed, it's one of the last things that go in. So just trying to make that as smooth as possible. Patching in, I like to see any patching in, say if they had a hole or a contaminant or a weed that had to be removed, that the patching in be 400 by 400 millimeters in size. That way it's going to have some stability, stay in situ, not blow away or not be taken away with a mower after its first mow. We also, particularly for councils and sports fields, we like to be on site during day 1 and the final day of planting or laying, just to make sure that quality control is there. Obviously, through the turf establishment phase or consolidation phase, it's also a good idea, like we do, to undertake routine inspections to monitor progress. You can see on screen there a few different installation opportunities or being used, from top left, hydros sprigging, top middle, line planting with turf slabs being put through the machine, which then puts out what we call sprigs or chunks of turf grass. Turf rolls, bottom left being jumbo rolls or maxi rolls, bottom centre turf slabs with soil attached or washed from the insert, and then the bottom right being a hybrid turf or ready to play turf grass. Also from turf installation, particularly washed, making sure there's little to no contamination within the turf grass. It's impossible for turf producers to give a guarantee that rocks will not be in there, but it's very important to know where the turf is coming from, what the paddocks are like. Do they have rocks within the paddocks? It's just an unfortunate situation where the rhizomes of the actual turf grass is so strong and they work or grow around those rocks. So sometimes to remove them, a double washing process may be required, or other practices may be needed as well. Some of the issues in relation to turf installation, the turf harvester, for example, the guillotine not cutting square, only a very minor issue, but from aesthetics, when the client turns up, particularly if it's a PBR or protected variety and they may be paying top dollar, it's just a situation we don't like to see. Turf joins, making sure the joins are very tight, buttoned up next to each other. So making sure that's specified and making sure the layers are aware of that and needing to rectify that immediately during the process, or needing to come back thereafter and fill such joins with top dressing sand. Pallet burn depends on your turf grass and how long it may be sitting there. Obviously try and delay definitely within 24 hours and usually the same morning after harvest. Preparation, also particularly from a residential setting where we see a lot of issues or a lot of problems. The homeowner may expect one thing, and sometimes it can be difficult for the installers to deliver based on their scope of works. Okay, just touching very briefly on soil. Topsoil selection is very important. Just in the next couple of slides, I just wanted to show you an example of some of the soils we've seen, which has been very, very poor. So making sure that selection is on point, and Mick will no doubt talk more about this. Another situation where we've seen rock on the surface, and after digging, this was a playing field where we could see considerable issues with this soil and sand and media that have been used. Subsoil compaction and root health is a big issue, particularly for some of the fine textured soils and the silt and clay. Coarse sands can be nice at times, but very quickly or freely draining, which then in turns requires a lot of input and water to maintain a healthy turf grass. Turf grass maintenance, just making sure that during that design phase you are thinking about the maintenance requirements. An old park on the left-hand side being Paspalum, predominantly Paspalum or Bahia. Was used as a soccer field, and you can see the amount of clip being there on the surface. The right-hand side was that Zoisy photograph used earlier on the embankment with some netting used for possibly installation and stability. However, trying to pull that netting material when I was there on the weekend, it just did not want to come loose. So thinking about the design process, how you're going to install that and how you're going to maintain that going forward. Just some common issues we see, areas closed, overuse, nutrition, the mowing, the high thatch, no renovations, the sand being used, often poor, soil compaction, irrigation, is it switched off? Many times we see a project come to fruition and then the irrigation just gets switched off. So making sure that it is operational, obviously with a cost associated, that's not overwatered as well. So making sure we're making best use of that water. And also the weeds and diseases present in the turf grass. Obviously not needing to control every weed or disease, but when threshold levels of pest, disease, or weeds are exceeded, needing to look or implement a pest management program. Mowing, we'd like to see mowing undertaken using the 1/3 mowing rule to not stress the grass too much unless you're in your spring or summer period when you're undertaking renovations. Decompaction, needing to decompact the soil. Turf grass replacement, you can see on the screen there from a sports field setting, making sure the turf grass, if needing replacing, is covering the full area, making sure the installation depth is adequate. So just doing your homework when the installation is required. Thatch on organics can cause a lot of issues in the soil. Infiltration can be poor. Top dressing materials, making sure we are getting into that thatch layer. To do so, using a scarification or dethatching device. You can see on the bottom right-hand corner, after use of the scarifier or dethatching device, of how that material is taken away, and it's amazing how much dead thatch material you do see within the surface. Different thatch reduction techniques. So for a larger area, the bottom left-hand photograph, you can see different levels or different intensity of the verticutter shown. Different machines being able to mow and scarify in one pass. And more aggressive machines where we use the term phrase mowing, where it has the ability to significantly mow, collect high levels of thatch and organic material across the surface. Nutrition, just briefly, just showing it's very important to maintain the nutrition of the turf grass. What are the actual elements? Where are you short? What is needed for the turf grass to maintain its function and purpose? I'd say at least annual soil testing is recommended. Pest and disease and weeds. Get to know your site, look for seasonal changes, the type of pest and disease and weeds, their life cycles, knowing when you need to implement a turf management program, whether it be the council community or the client and their expectations. Make notes of what outbreaks and changes you see, which will help you going forward. Make sure you conduct an integrated pest management plan and be sure you're aware of the environment, the staff and community safety. So that's my presentation today. Hopefully you've got some useful, knowledgeable information out of that. My contact details are on the screen and feel free to contact me.
Great, thanks Matthew for that informative presentation. We've got time for some questions now. There's a couple that have come through on the Q&A function down on the bottom of the tab bar. We'll kick it away, Matt. The first one is from Simon. Do you ever recommend soil fumigation for turf farms and the sports turf clients? And if they have any issues with invasive species impacting the industry, such as parasitic nematodes, ground pearls, weed species, etc.?
It's a good question from Simon. Particularly in the last few years, particularly turf farms and also sports fields where there has been an increase in such a demand. It just depends on the farms, their locations, and also the sites of where those facilities are as well. But I would suggest speaking with the agronomists and also such companies as well would be a good position to see where you're at and what's required. So,
fantastic. We've got another question from Brendan. What is the ideal depth of turf underlay for lawn areas in local parks?
Yep. But particularly for local parks, same as residential, the Australian standard specifies 75 millimetres. So, and that's of a reasonable to good quality soil. So many of the sites are quite poor or do have limited topsoil, or there may be horizon soil. So trying to increase that content, it's always going to make it better for the long-term maintenance. So if you can, ideally look to budget greater than that 75 millimetres. With some councils like that 100, even in a lovely world where they could go to 200. So it's also going to depend on your budget as well.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And I think Mick's going to touch on some of that in his presentation later. Got another one here from Lee. Can you comment on lead times for different turf species and other seasonal supply factors?
Can you repeat that question there, Matt?
Yeah, sure. Can you comment on lead times for different turf species and other seasonal supply factors?
Okay, it depends on the demand. In recent years, and particularly with COVID, some of the turf supplies have been, it's been tough. The lead-in times have been tough. So a lot of supplies are being sold. So particularly for a bigger project, trying to get on the front foot is desirable. So providing the specifications to the tenderers and to the turf farms is important. When we get into bigger projects, we like to lock in the turf supply as soon as possible. So that way we're not operating what we call at the cut face. So we can have some extra growth or extra time if required for a particular site if we need to get the turf grass to a particular standard. So sometimes the maturity of the turf can be a little bit less if the turf farms are selling a large frequency or quantity of material. So trying to initiate that conversation early in the piece with suppliers is very important.
Great, thanks, Matt. I've got one with regards to the erosion control standard. You touched on the example of the zoysia. Can you share any other insights around, I guess, the benefits and the pitfalls in using that standard? And do you think there's an opportunity to further promote it and utilise it in the industry?
Yeah, sure. And particularly up here in Brisbane, we've seen a lot more turf grass being utilised on the roadsides and verges and for erosion control in those areas as well. So there's been significant success as a result of using couches, but also Zoisy grass as well. So I guess the end users need to be aware of the installation requirements and also maintenance requirements for that establishment period. It's very important that the turf grass is established before they start to walk away from the site, where numerous times the turf grass is always last to go down, and then the contractors or the council or government could be moved on to the next area. So it's very important there's sufficient infrastructure, including water trucks, to irrigate and establish until those areas can look after themselves and just function under normal rainfall. But the use of turf grass, particularly having a minimum 2 metre strip or swath of grass in those areas to limit the erosion is very important, and the amount of sediment control and runoff and the positives are very high for the use of natural turf.
Fantastic, thanks, Matt. We've got another question from Tanya, and Mick's going to touch on this in quite a bit of detail. How do you prepare site soil for turf where the existing soil is clay?
Yeah, so trying to use your ameliorants or amendments to prepare that clay, like gypsum, for example, as a breaker, or trying to improve soil structure. Making sure you're not sealing that clay. Some machinery can provide a seal across the ground, so making sure you are breaking that seal to allow the water to get through into that clay material or hard material, and also allow a suitable area for your roots to move through your imported topsoil into your subsoil as well.
Fantastic. Just one final one from me, Matt. You mentioned the species selection chart for the different turf varieties and its application. What quickly has been some of the challenges with that? And will people be able to access that on the Turf Finder website?
Yeah, sure. And it's always a question we get asked, and we think about it at ad hoc or different times. So in preparation for this seminar, it gave me a bit of a time to sit down and put together the different varieties and species. It's good that numerous species and varieties fit different environments, and it's just seeing where that content best fits under that tree structure or dendrogram. So I did have a question the other day about cool season grasses and just needing to add that to the dendrogram or the mix. Given that I'm from Brisbane, I do have a bit of a favour towards the warm season grasses, but we have the information available on the cool season grasses as well, which we're happy to update and fine-tune that system. We will be adding the content to Turf Finder. We currently have a turf species and turf selection information page, but just trying to make that process a little bit easier to try and take away some of the confusion from people that are trying to identify what grasses are best suited to the areas. And hopefully, as part of a technical specification package or a informative package, we can make that available with the assistance of Turf New South Wales and Turf Australia as well.
Fantastic, Matt. Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for your questions. I'd just like to thank Matt for his time today and the detailed and very informative presentation. That concludes the first tranche of the webinar. We'll just take a quick break now for 15 minutes, and we'll start again at 12:55 with Dr. Mick Badham. So thank you, and we'll see you soon. Welcome back, everyone, to the second presentation of the day from Dr. Mick Badham from Ag Enviro Solutions. Mick is a certified professional soil scientist and irrigation agronomist with more than 25 years of experience. He specialises in sports turf, having overseen the reconstruction of fields that handle more than 55 hours per week of football without requiring turf patching. Mick was a primary author of the Love Your Garden program used to provide water-saving advice to more than 26,000 residents. He has provided advice on the amendment of more than 2,000 sporting fields and was a primary author of best practice guidelines for open space turf in both Sydney and the Lower Hunter Valley. He specified the soil in the construction of Barangaroo South and has provided advice on high-profile sites such as Hyde Park and Royal Randwick in Sydney. Mick will be talking about sources of suitable soil, amending soils, how deep should topsoil be, common mistakes made by designers, and when to ask for advice. Over to you, Mick.
Well, g'day everyone. My name is Mick Badham, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm a soil scientist working for Ag Enviro Solutions, and today I'll be talking to you about soils for use in landscape areas. And in order to do this, I'm going to go through these topics. So we're going to look at the impact that soil has on plant selection, look at some of the best types of soils that you can use, some of the common problems and how to amend soils, how deep they can be and when to go for advice, and some of the common mistakes that are made. Now, soil scientists have very different training to greenkeepers and landscape designers. A lot of us start out in agriculture and we map where soils are and why they are in the landscape and what processes are used in forming these soils. In my particular case, I worked in agriculture, and this wet spot, which you can see out of this soil profile here on the left, is a drip emitter that's buried in the ground, and we're trying to measure how wide the wetting pattern went around the drip emitter so that we could make sure that the wetting patterns from adjacent emitters overlapped, because if you didn't overlap them, even though it's river water in rural New South Wales, you ended up salinising everything. You can see all the salt on the surface there on the side. So a very, very different background, which often gives us a completely different perspective to that of greenkeepers. And I'll give you an example. This is a wet spot on a golf course where the greenkeeper got me involved to try and find out what techniques should be used to overcome this problem. Now, he was convinced that this new dam, which had just been constructed upslope of this wet spot, was the reason why the water was in this area. But I went up and had a look at the dam wall and dug a few holes and found out that it was actually pretty dry up in that area. So here's the wet spot. You can see the new dam, and you can see how close it is to the area where the wet spot has appeared. So it wasn't unreasonable for him to go and look in that area. But as a soil scientist, I look at this landscape very differently. And so the first thing I did was walk way up the hill here, about 300 metres away, and dig a hole. And I'm sure at this stage the greenkeeper thought I was quite stark raving mad to try and solve his waterlogging problems down the hill here. But it didn't take long, and I hit water. You see, the water was going across the top of the clay layer underneath. There was about a foot of water coming down the hill underneath the surface of the soil. So here it is coming down the hill, not across the surface, underneath the surface, and it of course appears out at the surface. And the dam just happened to be constructed during just prior to a wet period. So it was just a coincidence that the dam was constructed. Now, we decided to install a curtain drain across here, install a couple of them actually, to intercept this water so it couldn't get down to the wet spot and throw the water into the dam. Now, I told the greenkeeper to start digging from the outlet and go all the way back up the hill, but unfortunately he started at the top of the hill digging down, and it didn't end well. But eventually we got the water into the dam, and this water going into the dam didn't only just fix up his wet spot, it actually saved him about $23,000 a year in his water bill. Now, as a soil scientist, I've got to work on some pretty cool projects over the years. I did all the water balance modelling and some of the drainage stuff for Barangaroo Headland Park, and have been involved in, I wrote the soil specification for use in Barangaroo South. And got to work with some really cool people like Peter McMorr. I'm not sure whether you'd be familiar with him, but he's bred wintergreen and Windsor-green cooch and named Sir Walter Buffalo. And got to work with him on the reconstruction of the Kensington track and also giving advice on the course proper at Royal Wyoming. Now, most of the time I spend, whilst I still work in agriculture a lot, I spend most of my time giving advice on sporting fields, and surveyed about 2,000 of them over the years, probably about almost 30 golf courses and a whole heap of feature parks such as Hyde Park and Botanic Gardens. And I've been involved in writing a couple of best practice guidelines. This one's a freebie you can get off the web, but it's very outdated now. And there's another one that will be coming soon for the lower hunter. I was also involved in writing the Love Your Garden program. And this is where we went around and gave advice to 26,000 residents on how to save water in their garden and lawn areas. And what we noticed was if you have plants in half decent soil and the right sort of microclimate, then it's very easy to grow the plants without too much effort. However, if the soil is poor, even if the plants are in the shade, you can kill the plants, even if they're natives. In this particular case, you can see all these grevilleas, I think they're Robin Gordons, have died due to problems with the soil. You'll notice that the callistemons further down have hardly blinked, even though the soil is not very good. Which brings me to my first topic, and that is the impact of soil on plant selection. Now, broadly speaking, we can divide plants, if they're planted in from sun, into those that would need very high levels of water, all the way down to those that need very low levels of water. And whilst I've got 4 categories here for how much water they need, in reality, it's just a gradual sort of list of gradation. You know, so the difference between a Morea and a Dianella is sort of it's a bit arbitrary, and Morea would certainly go into the low use list if you don't mind your hedge being not so tall. Now, incidentally, a turf lawn area may fit in about around here, but if you are willing to just tolerate some reasonable amount of turf cover, you can see that it fits into a lower category. And if you want a much thinner but just somewhat cover of turf, you could even go lower again. Now, in Sydney, these plants, in order to grow healthy, you see the very high use plants need to be in a bit of shade, and a bit less shade is suitable for the high use plants, and the medium and the low use plants, provided the soil is half reasonable, they can survive without too much hassle, without any shade at all, provided the soil is pretty good. However, if the soil is poor, some of the medium water use plants, in this case, we've got some Nandinas here, start to struggle. And this is what we find, that although that's the normal situation, if the soil is poor, you need greater levels of microclimate protection, or shade, if you like, in order to be able to grow those plants in the poorer soil. So as the soil gets a bit poorer, you can no longer grow those very high-use plants. And the medium-use plants even now need to be in shade in order to survive. However, if the soil is even poorer again, those medium-use plants, and again, the Nandina I've picked on here, starts to die. You notice in the background there, I think that's Euonymus. It's hardly blinking, even though the soil is very poor, okay? So whilst that's a normal situation, as the soil gets pretty poor, you'll need some shade to look after the medium-use plants, and even the low-use plants need a little bit of shade in order to survive. You might think, really? That sounds a bit strange. Well, in fact, if you have the soil that bad, you can actually kill Amender. Not a bad effort, really. But it's not surprising. You see, here is the growing media that is sold by a soil supplier and advertised as a plant growing media. And yet, when I've sort of bashed the sample around a little bit in the bag, you can see it actually consists of 66% stones, yet it's sold as a growing media. Some of the growing media sold out there are absolutely terrible, and they can kill Amender. Okay, so if that's what a poor soil is, and poor soils place greater limits on what plants you can select, what represents a good soil? Now, broadly speaking, with regards to the texture of the soil, soil scientists divide soils into these categories. We actually use a lot more categories than this, but I'm just going to give you some of the more simpler ones. And you can see that it goes from sand all the way through to heavy clay. And as a general rule, heavy clays are very difficult to grow turf or other garden plants in, and they're generally unsuitable. However, there are some exceptions, and I'll show you one later on. The other thing that's very difficult to grow things in is sand. And you might be thinking, well, no, they use sands in stadiums and that, don't they? Well, look at the park at the just behind Bondi Beach, which a lot of it is irrigated, and you can see just how thin the turf cover is in places. And it's not like there's a lack of soil depth. You can grow very, very deep there. There's just no water and nutrients in these soils. Now, if you go to a moisture release curve or a moisture characteristic curve, it describes how much effort the plant needs to put on the left here relative to how much water is stored in the soil, okay? And the soil, the water that's available for uptake by the plant here is about 3%. So in other words, if we had 200 mils of topsoil, only 3% of it, so 6 millimeters, would be the amount of water that soil could hold. So if we had 100 mils of rain overnight, it will only capture no more than 6 millimeters. The other 94 millimeters would go to China. Of course, if the soil is already wet beforehand, it probably wouldn't catch much water at all. Now, you compare that to, say, a typical sandy loam. Now, this is only a typical situation, and it will hold about 9% water. However, half of this water, the plant has to put in considerable effort to get the water out of the soil. So whilst the plant is stressed in getting this water, it's sort of being trickle-fed to the plant, so it keeps it alive. So in other words, not only does a sandy loam hold 3 times the amount of available water for the plant, it actually can go for about 5 times longer, possibly even longer, and survive through periods without rainfall because it's got this slow release form of water. Even though the plant's stressed, it's slowly going to trickle feed it so it still survives. You might be thinking, but sands, they're used in stadiums, aren't they? Well, the answer is yes, they are, but they put gravel underneath the sand in order for the sand to hold an inflated amount of moisture. The other thing that they do is they mix coconut fibre, 10 to 20% of this material, and other things such as peat into these soils in order to make them hold, again, an inflated amount of moisture. They also need stabilising fibres to stop the sand moving around, and they have to water them and fertilise them sometimes on fortnightly intervals in order to keep the turf healthy. So in other words, the maintenance budget in that is basically quite high for these fields because essentially you're having to change its nappy. And even then, you can see some of these sand-based fields create problems. It's actually very difficult to grow materials in sands. They don't hold any moisture and they don't hold any nutrients. So if you go and build your local sporting field out of a sand, it's not going to do very well. And you look at this grass cover and it doesn't look too different to what it looks like on the back of a beach, does it? This is some buffalo trying to get onto the beach at Maroubra. Okay, so if sands are so difficult, what about 80-20? 80-20 is a mixture of 80% sand and 20% soil. And a lot of the landscape industry think this is the best type of soil for use in the construction of turf and garden areas. But that's, in fact, completely incorrect. 80-20 has come about from bowling green situations, again, intensely managed situations, and it's very poorly suited to a lot of the situations like in sporting fields and passive parks. See, 80% sand and 20% soil, but the soil component is often generally somewhere around a loamy sand through to a sandy clay loam at the most, but most of the time it has a sandy loam texture. So if you've got 20% sandy loam and you mixed it with 80% sand, you actually end up with a silty sand. So I know it's very, very sandy. So the question is, does the turf like it? Well, this pile of 80-20 has been on the ground here for about a year. Does the turf appear to be growing into it? Not really at all, does it? It doesn't seem to like it at all. The other thing that you'll notice is it's set like a brick, even though it's extremely sandy. Now, when you put 80-20 into the holes on sporting fields around Sydney, a lot of the time the turf ends up going thin. And it's not surprising because the subsoil sucks all of the moisture out of this very sandy mix, which doesn't have any nutrients. And so you end up with very thin turf. And I'm sure many of you have seen situations where fields have been top dressed with sandy materials such as this. Now, if you build your home lawn out of an 80-20 mix, what happens is the moment they put in the drought and water restrictions, it will die, and it will die to such an extent that it may not recover at all. And this turf here is rapidly going backwards, even though it has another 3 or 4 weeks left before recovering rains will take care of it. But you can see it's died out completely in some areas. Now, this field here is up near Lake Macquarie. It was built out of a material that has a similar type consistency to 80-20, and it used about as much water as a rice crop during its first season. Now, when they had water restrictions up there, they were only permitted to water this field twice a week during the summer. And this is what it looked like during the water restrictions when they're watering it twice a week. Now, you compare that to the field about 5 kilometres away, maybe 10 kilometres away, but it's also an AFL field, and it just had site soil that we'd amended with compost. And during the same period, it hardly even looks like there's any water restrictions on it. It easily made it through. 80-20 doesn't hold any moisture. And if you build a sporting field that doesn't have an irrigation system out of 80-20, then the moment there's a really dry spell, it's just going to die completely. Now, if you're still not convinced about how bad 80-20 is, I want you to consider what happens and have a look around cricket wickets. There's a cricket wicket under this pile of soil here. So what they're doing is they're going to cover over this cricket wicket during the winter sports season so that they can play across the area. So what they've done is they've put a geofabric over the wicket and they're covering it with 80-20. And eventually they'll lay turf on top, okay? So here they are smoothing out the 80-20 over the surface. But at the end of the sports season, they'll remove this soil and uncover the wicket so it's ready to play, right? But when they do that, they spread all the 80-20 around near the wickets, which is why so many of the areas around these wickets have very thin turf cover. Here's another one, and here's another one. Okay, now this field here, you can see not only have they spread the 80-20 around, they've left it all around the wicket, so that's created a mound, a big no-no. What's interesting is just how thin the grass is just alongside the wicket here where all the 80-20 is. And don't let those green little bunchy type grasses convince you that's just crabgrass. It's actually a weed. And this wicket, by the way, hasn't been covered in 3 years, and you can see it still hasn't recovered. 80-20 is pretty poor mix for use in gardens and on passive turf and sporting fields. Okay, so I've said heavy clays are unsuitable, sands are unsuitable, and silty sands such as 80-20 are generally quite unsuitable. However, all of the other soil types, if they're appropriately amended, make completely suitable growing medias for a lot of situations. Now, obviously, the heavier textured soils might be less suited to high-use fields, but so where can we get some suitable soil from? And the answer is the best source of suitable soil is often just reuse the site soil, amend it first, and here are a range of different site soils where they're all growing acceptable turf cover. Now, if you look in the bottom left-hand side here, the clay loam situation, you can see a few dead areas in the turf there. That's actually not the clay loam areas. That's where they put the 80-20, just to ram home the point a little bit further about how poor a mix that is. Okay, if amending the site soil is a good source of soil, what's another suitable source of soil? And that would be from a quarry. And sometimes you have to use this because there is no existing site soil. And what is interesting, though, is just how variable the soil from quarries are. And you can see the orange supplier here, which is supplier B, has a much higher level of nutrients to either the grey or the blue supplier, which have very, very low levels of nutrients in their soil that you would source from them. However, if you compare all of those suppliers to just typical site soil, you can see that the typical site soil is often superior to that which you would purchase from a soil supplier. Okay, so you can amend the site soil, you can buy some quarried soil. Another source of suitable soil is recycled soil. So that's the soil that you get from skip bins that's passed through the various EPA requirements. And I use this to reconstruct my back lawn. Now, you might think, oh, wow, that recycled soil looks like it's lovely and dark in coloured. Well, that's because I asked them to mix in some cow manure with the soil. And I wanted to use composted garden organics, but unfortunately that supplier didn't have any. But I use the cow manure in with the recycled soil, and it makes an excellent growing media, not for high-use fields, but certainly for situations like this. And here is my front lawn and my garden. It's only very young in these photos, and you can see that they're both thriving. Okay, so I've talked about what types of soils are the best. So not the sands, not the 80-20s, not the heavy clays, but most of the other soils you can use, and you can go to the quarry, okay? Or you can get the recycled soils. Let's talk about amending soils. Soils that you purchase from a quarry almost always set hard. However, the existing site soils around Sydney and certainly across most of Australia, they also set hard, okay? And when you remove all the turf from these areas, you can see that it's actually more like a concrete slab that you've got underneath. Now, what they do, there's a machine called an earth plate that goes through and slices these sporting fields. But often what happens is you're not actually breaking up the soil structure so much as just slicing up the concrete slab into bricks. What this soil needs is organic matter. This soil here, the soil in this photo, it has acceptable levels of calcium, so it's not going to respond to gypsum or lime or anything like that. It's not sodic. It's just purely got problems with organic matter levels, okay? And it sets hard naturally because a lot of the fine materials and the coarse materials fit very well around each other, a bit like a jigsaw, so that they set very, very hard, okay? Now, we're fortunate here in New South Wales to have an excellent source of organic matter, and that comes from your green bins. They remove the rubbish and compost it, and if it's composted to Australian standard, then you'll end up with no viable weed seed, and they'll have contaminant levels that are low or non-detected. And you can see once they put it through a fine screen, you end up with a material such as this. And it's excellent for amending soils. This will increase how much nutrients the soil can hold. It obviously adds nutrients in and of itself, but it also stops the soil setting hard, okay? So we've mixed in some compost to this soil and it no longer sets hard, okay? Now, the nutrients that turf wants, and the same is true for a number of, a lot of garden plants, they want a nitrogen to phosphorus to potassium ratio of about 9:1 to roughly 6. We don't know exactly what the ratio is because some of the fundamental research has not been done, but roughly those ratios. And if you compare how chicken manure does, you can see it provides a very poor balance of nutrients relative to what the turf needs, okay? Now, chicken manure is not the only source of manure. There are lots of other sources of manure. And in this particular case, you can see that the cow manure provides probably the best ratio of nutrients out of all of the manures. And it's not surprising, really. Cows eat grass and they fully digest grass. So is it surprising that their poo has a chemistry somewhat similar to the nutrient requirements of grass? Now, manure is not the only source of organic matter. There are other sources, blood and bone, seaweeds, that. Look at how well the composted garden organics, the green bars there, match the nutrient requirements of the turf. And again, this is not surprising because if you take grass clippings and garden trimmings and you compost them down, is it surprising that they have a chemistry similar to what garden plants or lawn areas will require? It's not surprising at all. Okay. Now we've mixed compost, the composted garden organics, in with soil on lots and lots of sporting fields, and you can see how well the grass grows relative to the control areas. And again, it's not just adding nutrients, it's adding nutrient holding capacity and stopping the soil from setting hard. Now, I developed a new top dress that consists of a mixture of soil and composted garden organics, and we left it in the middle of a field for about 6 months. No, it's just not this pile on the right. That's the 80-20. Here it is here underneath this here. And you can see the grass, it's about 6 to 8 months later, the grass from all the surrounding areas is just completely grown straight over the top of the pile. Now, organic matter, I've talked about compost and manures that we use. What amenders we use will depend on what's wrong with the soil to start with. And whilst a lot of soils set hard and they have low levels of nutrients, that's why we add a lot of compost to and manures to different soils. But as a soil scientist, you quite often add lime or gypsum, which many people would be familiar with. But we also add a lot of other additives as well. Sometimes we add stuff like kieserite, dolomite. There are lots of different sulfate of potassium. Lots of different amenders. Sometimes we even add clays like zeolite and sands and all these different additives, even fine silica dust in some situations. There's no single recipe. All we are doing as a soil scientist is identifying a suitable soil type, and then we fix whatever is limiting in it. So if it's setting hard, we'll add organic matter to it and possibly calcium to it. If it's deficient in certain nutrients, we'll add those nutrients to it, okay? If it's got a low cation exchange capacity, we'll add organic matter to it. There's no single recipe, okay? So how do you amend soil? Find out what's wrong. Pick a suitable soil, find out what's wrong with it, and then overcome its shortcomings. Okay, so how deep should the topsoil be? Well, look at my old lawn relative to my neighbours. The difference is I had 3 times as much soil depth as he did. I'd also amended the subsoil underneath, okay? So if he's only got 60 mils, he's going to need to water it twice a week in order to maintain turf cover. So he can get a decent lawn out of it. He's just going to have to water it a lot. Whereas I only need to water mine about once a fortnight because of I've got the extra soil depth and I've amended the subsoil. Okay. What's the chances of it raining twice a week for him? Well, it's only going to happen about 17% of the time during summer. What's the chances of it raining once a fortnight, which is all I need to get a reasonable turf on my front lawn? See, 75% of the time, summer rains will take care of it. Okay, so very little effort needed, just simply because I've got taken the extra effort to make the soil deeper, but also to amend the soil underneath. So if it doesn't rain for 15 days, guess what? Mine's on day 2 of its drought, and his is on day 12 of his drought. Now, here is a sporting field, and again, you see similar situation. You see the thin turf in one area, and it's performing in other areas, and you slide in the soil depth information, and you can see what's going on here, okay? Now, with really tough plants, and turf's a bit like this too, but say a Morea hedge, if the soil is really shallow, it won't die, it'll just end up not growing as fast. And so if you've got 150 mils of soil, then you end up with a hedge that's sort of a bit below waist height. But, and it'll eventually grow to a tall hedge. It'll just grow slower. Now, larger trees. Well, if you need 200 to 300 mils for turf, depending on what you do to the subsoil and what the topsoil characteristics are, a larger tree you're going to need a lot deeper, and typically sort of up to 400 mils for some trees, but up to 600 to 800 mils for very large figs and some of the very large trees. Now, you might be thinking 600 to 800 mils, well, that's no good. Like, that's very expensive. Well, often site soils have between 200 to 300 millimeters of natural topsoil existing on them already. And look at where this roadway is. I know it's only an informal track. Where is the soil from it? It could have been used in those areas as well, so that there was extra depth there, yeah? So what happens if you only use 150 millimeters of topsoil? And the answer is, well, you end up with a fig 25 years later that's not much taller than head high. And can everyone say bonsai? Okay, which brings me to common mistakes that are made. Now, the first mistake that I see is a lot of greenfield sites where they basically destroy the site topsoil. If you look at this soil profile here, that topsoil there, that red stuff up the top there is wow stuff. You could grow potatoes in that. The soil underneath that is actually a medium to heavy clay texture. However, because of where this soil is from, we can actually amend this soil so that it's actually very suitable for maybe a passive turf area, or certainly for garden areas. You have to amend it right though. And then underneath that is what is somewhere between soil and rock, and that's completely unsuitable. So the first thing, of course, you do, as a developer, is to mix the whole lot together. You see the site topsoil still there? Can you see little bits of red tinge here and there throughout it? Little bits everywhere, isn't there? And then when you go to build a sporting field out of this material, it doesn't end well, okay? And in this particular case here, the developer built the field and the council refused to accept handover of the field, and I was brought in and we had to import a whole heap of soil to reconstruct this field again, and it had never been used, simply because the site topsoil had been all destroyed during the construction process, okay? So mistake number one was destroying the soil at the start, okay? So the second most common mistake that I see is people use completely unsuitable soils. So unsuitable soils such as 80-20, yeah? Now, I would use it for a bowling green, but in most situations it is unsuitable, okay? The other thing that is unsuitable is any unamended soil, okay? Just because a soil is a suitable soil type doesn't mean it's going to grow decent grass if you don't amend its problems, okay? And as I was saying earlier, you need to be very wary of advice from soil suppliers. In some cases, the soil suppliers define the best soil for you to use as whatever they've got the greatest pile of out the back, okay? And you need to also be aware that quite a few of the contractors will also provide you with some very biased advice. And I've seen sporting fields constructed using very inferior products that the contractor said would be suitable, and in fact, they were never suitable. It is hard to believe, though, that there are soil mixes out there as bad as this one here, but it's commonly sold as a growing media, and yeah, 66% stones. And I see this kind of stuff all the time. There are very, very bad soil mixes out there. Okay, so if you have to amend the soil, I often get asked, what is the best amender to use? Which brings me to our mistake, failing to amend the soil. You see, most people don't use any amenders whatsoever, or they'll throw a bit of gypsum in and think, oh, that's going to fix the problem. Well, if the soil's low in calcium, then maybe the gypsum was the way, or at least part of the solution to the problem. Thing is, there is no one best amender. Yeah, there's no one recipe. Yeah, this soil here, this is a loamy sand. So in other words, it's suitable soil that we could use to build a sporting field, but it's rock hard. It also holds low levels of nutrients. It's deficient in potassium, and it's also deficient in micronutrients. So all we had to do was add some goodies, in this case, some organic matter and a few fertilizers to this soil, and we could have grown decent turf. But they didn't amend the soil. And so here we have a situation where it sets hard and performs very poorly. Okay. Now, we've surveyed a whole heap of sporting fields in the Lower Hunter, and similar type situations, although it does vary a bit across Sydney. Here were the most common problems we saw on sporting fields as a legacy of people not amending the soils during reconstruction. Now, CEC is cation exchange capacity is a measure of the nutrient holding capacity of the soil. And you can see that it is the most common problem, very low levels of nutrient holding capacity. In other words, the soils were generally infertile. Yeah. The other thing that we've found is that almost 2/3 of the fields were setting like a brick. Yeah. And so a lot of these soils need nutrient holding capacity and their hardness addition are dealt with. And so in other words, they needed organic matter added to them, the right type of organic matter and significant quantities of it. The third most common problem that we found was water repellency, and that's where water will not go into soils. Now, this is more common in sands, but you see it in clay soils, and so it won't wet the surface properly. And there are various wetting agents that you can add to overcome these problems, but had they amended the soil correctly in the first place, it would probably be less likely to form water repellent situations, or certainly much easier to manage if they have done things correctly. The fourth mistake, and this is so common, is for drainage mistakes to occur. This particular situation, they had rolled the subbase and then put a very sandy growing media on the surface. And you can see all that happens is the water goes down straight through the sand and hits the subbase and stays there. And I just happen to have dug a hole. You see the water seeping out through the side the moment I've dug the hole. Okay. If you're looking at landscaping situations, I've often described to landscape designers how to construct, how to plant plants in beds. And invariably, if I'm not watching, they'll go and immediately take what I've said and put a gravel layer underneath it, thinking that that will improve the drainage even further. Remember I said earlier, gravel underneath sand profiles, and the same with soil profiles, makes the soil hold an inflated amount of water above it, okay? I know it's counterintuitive, but it's basically because the gravel doesn't suck down, whereas the subsoil would, okay? And so as a result, you're going to end up with a tree that's going to die here, or at the very least it's going to struggle. It's probably going to get pathogen problems because it's going to get very wet root zone. And the other thing I see is common is they tell people to line the root ball with peat moss and stuff like that. That's the best way to stop water going through it as well. So that's also going to create waterlogging problems. And waterlogging plus organic matter that's depth in the ground is basically a recipe for fungal diseases, and it's not going to end well. Okay. Now, waterlogging is not easy to overcome. Okay. A lot of the problems with waterlogging issues is that they're caused by multiple issues. This particular site here has 5 different causes of waterlogging. Okay. It's got the tide, a water table, it's too flat, slow infiltration, all these issues, yeah? You might think, oh, that's a very unique site. No, it's not. We surveyed a whole heap of fields in the Lower Hunter, about 255 fields, and about a third of them had waterlogging problems. And of those third, here were the most common causes we saw on those fields. And on average, each field that had waterlogging problems had at least 2 to 5 different causes of the problems. So you're better off leaving drainage situations to a soil physicist to sort out. However, in saying that, I will address the most common problem causing waterlogging problems here, and that is run-on. You see, impermeable surfaces, in this case it's a basketball court, but it could be the roof of a building or a car park, should not be allowed to run onto turf areas or into garden beds, okay? It causes waterlogging problems. And so if you can avoid situations like that, then you will address one of the most common causes of waterlogging problems, okay? Okay. So that's some of the common mistakes. Let's deal with when to ask for advice. And of course, I've just given you the first reason, and that is in situations where there is the potential for, or there already are, drainage problems. Okay, go and get advice. Often as a soil scientist, we can simply amend the soil. There's no drainage being put in this soil here. We've just amended the soil so the water can easily penetrate through the soil and get through the root zone. Compare that to the situation where we haven't amended the soil and you've got waterlogging problems everywhere. It's actually exactly the same site soil, we just happen to have amended it on the left, okay? The second situation where you should be asking for advice is whenever the soil, drainage and earthworks total combines to more than $40,000 worth of cost. Now, it's a pretty small job if you're importing mixes and that. And now, why did I pick $40,000? Because about 5% of $40,000 is $2,000, which is what it would cost to get a soil scientist involved on a very small project, okay? So they'll easily recover their funds. And a soil scientist often hire out for cheaper rates than some of the other industries, some of the engineers and that. And so it's often value for money anyway. Reason number 3, if you've got a situation where the site topsoil could be reused, then you really should engage a soil scientist. You see, in this picture here, it looks like the brown stuff's the topsoil and the other stuff underneath is the subsoil, right? Well, yes, that's true, but I've actually had a look at this soil profile and everything down to there is actually suitable. So if we needed to create a growing media that was, say, 300 millimeters deep, can you see that by amending that other stuff underneath, we no longer have to import any soil? And in fact, we've got enough growing media here for even for very large trees. What is interesting though, the suitable material that I've marked there, in addition to the topsoil over the top, is very similar, that suitable material, to the not suitable looking material beneath it. And who but a trained eye would know the difference there? You see, sometimes you'd be very surprised just how heavy a texture soil or just how unsuitable soils can appear to look. But if a soil scientist gives you the correct amenders to use, that you can actually grow really decent plants, or really, in this case, really decent turf cover on it. Now, that's when to get advice. Where do you go to get advice? If you want soil advice, you go to a certified professional soil scientist. It's its own profession, soil science. Don't go to a greenkeeper that they'll have done a TAFE course or 2 in soil science. Okay, you would ask them for advice for what spray to use on your green. Okay, go to a certified professional soil scientist. make sure they've got at least 10 years of experience. Now, every time you send soil samples off to a lab, you'll get advice from a soil chemist, okay? So a soil physicist is what you need when you're dealing with the on-site stuff. He'll send the stuff off to the lab anyway so the soil chemist can deal with it. And if you're dealing with situations where you're amending turf areas, then you want to make sure that the person also has some turf knowledge as well. When to get advice? Well, generally, it's the very start of the project, before they destroy the topsoil here, yeah? Or before they consider importing soil when the site soil could be reused, okay? All right, so we've gone through and looked at how very bad soils limit the plants that you can use. And if the soil mix is bad enough, you can actually struggle to grow lamandra and really tough stuff like turf as well. We've talked about how very sandy soils and 80-20 and heavy clays are pretty unsuitable. Most other soils, if you amend them, can provide an excellent growing media. And we talked a little bit about how you've got existing site soils, an excellent source, you've got quarry soils, and you've also got those recycled soils. And we talked about some of the common mistakes and when to ask for advice, okay? I just wanted to show you some of the capabilities of amended site soil as we go. Now, I should say this case study I'm about to show you is on Middlehead Oval, and we've made some videos on this. You can go to my website there and click on the media link, and there's about 5 or 6 minute videos there. And Middlehead Oval really struggled for years, and you can see that it's a soccer field inside an AFL field. And each year they were patching with about 1,000 square metres of turf. And the soccer club and the AFL club were frustrated with such a bad field. And so they approached council and they were going to convert the field to synthetic. Now, there was a fair backlash from the community, from some of the environmental groups, and there was also a backlash from the Headland Preservation Group and other organisations. And they managed to prevent council from installing synthetic turf at that site, certainly in the interim period. And so council decided that they would try out what would happen if they used best practice management techniques and construction techniques to rebuild their field. Now, I should point out, it gets very high levels of use, this field. It receives 49 hours per week of football during the winter sports season. Now, we amended the existing site soil, okay? We didn't import soil, amended the existing site soil. And at the end of the football season, so this is the last week of the football season, I've taken this photo, and you can see that after we've amended it, it's easily made it through the winter sports season. Now, the club loves it. And the nearby Men's Premier League club moved their home games to this field here. So it no longer gets 49 hours a week of football. It now gets 55 hours a week of football. It also gets another 10 and a half hours a week of fitness training from the nearby naval base. So obviously in 2021, we had an interrupted COVID season. It had been a very wet June. And at the start of July, the season was stopped. And I took this photo at the start of July, and this is probably the worst area on the field. You can see that it's maintained acceptable grass cover. It's starting to get a bit thin, but it was going to make it through without any turf patching. It didn't need any patching, and had it have gone the extra 6 weeks of the season, it wouldn't have needed any patching either. It would have made it easily. And if you go down to where the goal square is, this is some of the worst areas on the field where the goal umpire stands, because it gets a bit wet in those areas because the slip drainage system never went off the field. The contractor stopped it at the edge of the field rather than going off to the perimeter a little bit. Now, if you look in this photo, in the left-hand side, you can see the amenity building. And if you look on the ground in front of the amenity building, you'll notice that the turf looks a bit duller. It actually is fine. When you go over near it, it generally looks like this in most areas. And I should say those white stems that you see there, they're fine. They will reshoot grass during the spring, and it will rapidly grow back. Okay, so this is a field getting 49 hours a week of wear and easily 55, I should say, and easily handling it. Now, having looked near the amenity building, look on the other side of the field. Look at how green the grass is. Okay, I'm going to show you what the field looks like over there. But before I show you, keep in mind, I'm taking this photo in July after it's received 55 hours a week of wear. Can you see that they've hardly put a footstep on this side of the field? Yeah. So in other words, this field is handling 55 hours a week of wear, but the club are not spreading their wear evenly. So if they just spread their wear more evenly, they'd end up with a field that didn't wear out anywhere near as much. I mean, it's still surviving without any dramas, but they could have a nicer field at the end of the winter sports season. Or, if you like, alternatively, they could have more players play on this field and they could use this side of the field. It's astounding to think that this is what it looks like in July, which I'm sure you'll agree makes for a very happy ending. Questions?
Fantastic, Mick, and thank you for that informative presentation and some great examples there of, some before and after. And I can attest to the Middlehead Oval. We did have an event there 2 years ago or thereabouts, and it was fantastic to see that live. And we'd certainly be happy to share that experience with Mick and others with other walk and talks as part of this project moving forward. Okay, on to some Q&A questions. We've got a few that are coming here on the Q&A box. The first one from Tabon for you, Mick. The composted garden organics, are they only available from certain suppliers, i.e. through contracted companies? Sorry, Mick, we're just having trouble hearing you.
You hear me now?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Sorry. The compost, it should adhere to, you should make sure it adheres to Australian standard. And material that adheres to Australian standard, use the more finely screened material, so the less than 8 mil or less than 10 mil, depending on which supplier you use for soil profiles, but you can use a slightly coarser material for use in the gardens. And it's available from, say, around Sydney, you've got Soil Co, ANL, and Suez. But if you go into other areas, you've also got suppliers in Remondis and I think J.R. Richards, but there are other suppliers out there.
Fantastic, Nick. Thank you. We've got another one from Tanya. I have a site with heavy clay. Do we have no other option than to remove some clay, rip the clay with addition of sand, and lay turf underlay directly on top? Will we need to install subsoil drainage with a slope of about 1 in 50?
Yeah, good question. So there's a few things in that. Is the clay heavy clay to start with? If you texture it and it turns out that it's only light clay, in other words, it can be moved around in your hand, then quite often you can simply amend that soil. You'll have to look at what's wrong with it. But if it's heavy clay, if it indeed it is heavy clay, a few exceptions to this rule, but generally speaking, it wouldn't matter what you amended that with, it's not going to grow decent grass. So if you mixed a whole heap of sand, even a 50-50 mix of sand with a heavy clay, you'll still end up with basically a heavy clay, maybe a medium clay at best, and it'd be unsuitable. Interesting though, if it's got a slope on the ground of about 1 in 50, if the site has run-on from other areas, say a car park or something, then you should stop that from occurring. And if you've got a uniform slope of 1 in 50 and it's, say, a light clay, you probably get away without any drainage whatsoever, depending on the slope length, simply because it doesn't have a high enough infiltration to let the water through. It will just simply sheet off the surface. So the question then is, can that water get away? If the water can get away as surface flow, then you probably get away with it. And I've seen a sporting field with a slope of about 1 in 60, I think it was, and it was a flood event down at Albion Park, and it was playable about 10 minutes, 20 minutes afterwards, and even though the roads were cut.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got another one from David. What would you recommend to be used for top dressing? Now, I assume that means turf once it's down.
Yeah, so top dressing, you top dress fields whenever they're, say, too shallow. That's a reason why you top dress fields, or you might top dress a field quite often because it's too uneven. So don't top dress it just for the sake of top dressing it. In situations like where Matt lives up in Queensland and that, you often have to top dress because it's too thatchy. So there are some situations. The best type of material to top dress your soil with is to match exactly the same soil type as you're currently got already on site. So there are machines. There's a machine called a recycling top dress machine. It saws through the soil like a circular saw, and it will generate about 4 to 5 millimeters of top dress, which goes on a conveyor belt, and they can sweep that around. That's one way of top dressing. Another way of top dressing is to go to a soil supplier and try and match the soil that you've currently got on site. It doesn't have to be a perfect match, but you can't add sand, for example, on top of a soil type situation, because you'll wreck it. The exception to that rule is where you've got slit drainage already installed. So you're trying to match the existing site soil in terms of texture.
Just on that topic, Mickey, you're seeing more in the work specification work you're doing, that you're visiting more farms to get that specification like for like onto sports field and other applications?
Yeah, certainly I can find soil supply. There's soil suppliers out there that can mix and match what's going on. There's a big push in Sydney from the soil suppliers to try and use sand because it's so available in Sydney. But the moment you sort of leave Sydney and go out west a little bit, nobody's got any sand, and then they're all of a sudden everybody's recommending the soils, which is what you would typically recommend. The other thing that you need to do, Matt touched on this as well, you need to make sure the soil from the turf farm doesn't cause layering problems when you lay it on the surface of the soil profile. And I've seen this in situations where they've built this sand-based profile and laid turf with medium clay attached to it across the top, and it won't drain. The soil, you have to match the two together. And yeah, so we've been slowly mapping the soils across the turf farms across Sydney.
Fantastic. We've got some great questions coming in. There's one from Christopher. Are non-ionic or ionic wetters best for reducing hydrophobicity?
Yes, well, it kind of depends on the situations. The best thing you can do with wetting agents is to swap them different modes that they use each time you alternate the wetting agents. So one time you use one with one mode, the next time you use one with another mode of action. But if the soil's amended to start with, it's pretty easy to manage the water repellency.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mick. We've got one here from Lee. You mentioned avoiding runoff areas into landscape. Can you comment about water-sensitive urban design approaches?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Water-sensitive urban design is sort of backwards to the way you'd want things to be done in nature. Throwing the water into a spot causes waterlogging often, but they get around that problem by building these rain gardens out of very sandy materials. Now, that falls apart when there's a dry spell because and a lot of these gardens do very poorly. And I live in sort of Western Sydney, and everybody regards them as a really good place to grow wild tomato and all these other weeds in those situations. They'd be better off putting some soil amenders into those very sandy profiles in those rain gardens so that they can hold a lot more water. So there are other amenders that you can use that don't block up so they still allow the water to go through fairly rapidly, but nonetheless, they've got to make it so that these rain gardens aren't running out of water by day 3 or 4 without rain. Otherwise, you're just going to end up growing weeds because all the plants die.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got another one from Greg that's come through on the chat channel. Some perspectives on machinery or methods to incorporate organics, for argument's sake, into existing fields that are under usage, that are being used. So how can you get those amendments into fields that are currently in use?
It's a very tough situation. It really should have been built correctly to start with. But you certainly can, if the field is closed over summer, you can certainly put the amenders on the surface, rotary hoe it in, level the surface out, and simply let the turf recover from what you've buried in the ground. It will grow back. And I've seen fields where you've done that, and you can get them back in 8 to 12 weeks. I've seen fields being played on, soccer fields 10 weeks after we rotary hoed it. Freaked the daylights out of the council that we did it to, but 10 weeks later, they were playing soccer on it again. And in that particular case, it actually fixed their drainage problems, not just their soil problems. In a lot of situations, though, you actually can just add it as a component of your top dress. So you might add a 50-50, sort of 50 soil, 50 organics, or even 70 soil, 30 organics, depending on what you're doing. And so it slowly builds up over time. If you fertilize turf a little bit more heavily, you can actually try and get the turf to actually give you some organics themselves. So, but a lot of fields are under fertilized.
Fantastic. I've got one for you around Barangaroo, the side, and you mentioned the soil specification that you had to do. Can you give our audience a bit of an idea about what's in a soil specification spec for a job like that, please?
So essentially, all I'm trying to do is find a source of material from a quarry. In that particular case, we didn't have site soil because it was previously car park or rock areas and that. So you're trying to pick a soil that will allow the trees and the grass to survive with little or no external inputs. But at the same point in time, you need to make sure that it's going to, in the case of the lawn areas, handle very high levels of wear. So I said during the talk that 80-20 and those very sandy soils are very unsuitable. But certainly that particular mix was right up the sandy end, and a lot of organics in the soil. It's still a soil. It's soil with organics in it, so that we can grow the turf very fast. And we've got to be very careful that there's no layers. I noticed earlier there was a question around underlays. Generally, underlays, you're trying to, again, match what's underneath. You don't want distinct layers in your soil. If you're wanting to put an underlay down because the soil underneath is not that suitable, then you're probably better off finding a way to amend the soil underneath so that the underlay and it don't form a knife edge boundary. You want them to be no distinct layers as best as you can. And whilst it's 75 millimeters in the Australian standard, you're going to grow pretty poor turf and plants, as you would have seen, if the site soil is not that suitable. Having said that, if the site soil is loosened up, a lot of naturally occurring site soil, and you put material on top, you can grow decent stuff. It just depends. You can't grow it into really rock hard soils, though.
And Mick, as a follow-up to that one, if people are interested in learning more about soils, is there platforms like the Australian Society of Soil Science, or are there other sites that you recommend that are good as learning areas in this
Yeah, you could certainly contact Australian Soil Science, and but the other situations, there's a lot of fact sheets and information that we put out. Yeah, there's information out there. Unfortunately, there's very few soil scientists specialising in sports turf. I'm not aware of too many others, actually. A lot of other people are a greenkeeper or some other horticulture trained, and then they've learnt some soil science on the way. So it's just a bit of a backwards industry. There's not very many of us.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Mick, and thank you for your interesting presentation. People can get in touch with agenviro.com.au.
No, just .com.
.com, I beg your pardon.
And those videos are up there too.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, thanks everybody. That actually concludes the learning event for today. I hope you've enjoyed the event. A survey will be forwarded to all attendees in the next 24 hours. So if you could please fill that in, it would be most appreciated. I'd certainly like to thank Matt and Mick, Tim and ASN Events, their team, Hort Innovation, together with our project partners in funding this event. We're hoping that post-COVID that we can run some more face-to-face events, not only in New South Wales, but nationally. So please watch out for them. And I hope you have enjoyed the day and you have a great afternoon. Thank you.